Well, we were talking about state responsibility. In the last class, we have mentioned our source and we have gone through the articles. Now let's dive into the details of state responsibility. In state responsibility, there are certain elements that you always have to keep in mind. First of all, state responsibility is established in between at least two states. When state A directly gives damage to state B, then state responsibility is established. That's the first thing. Second thing, well, it seems bilateral. It can also be multilateral. The damage can be given on multiple states. Or here we can also come across with multiple states. So state responsibility is established at least in between two states. So it's bilateral. It can also be multilateral. To be able to speak about state responsibility, first of all, we look for what? You tell me. Obligations. And then what happens is that a wrongful act happens. The wrongful act can be an action, but it can also be remaining still. Remaining passive can also cause breaches. So it can be an action, that can also be an omission. The thing is that, first of all, the wrongful act takes place, and then it is imputable on the state. So this is the second element that we look for. First of all, we see if there was an obligation and if a breach has happened. The breach can happen in two ways, as an action, as an omission. And if this breach is attributable, imputable on the state or not, definitely. At the third place, we try to find out if a damage is given. So this is how state responsibility is established. We have said that the obligation part is the objective element. In order to talk about if a breach has taken place, you can see the treaties. If there's a treaty related to what has happened, if there are obligations on state A, and if state A has breached its obligations mentioned under one treaty. So this is something objective. This is something quite concrete. All right? There's one more thing that we did not mention in our last class. That's about tort. That's also known as Tortious Act. Tort is, well, let's start like that. All crimes are tort, but not all tortious actions are crimes. Under Tortious Act, one party has rights, and when those rights are not correctly used, for instance, then some damages can be caused on possessions of others or lives of others. So a harm is given to the possessions, to satellite of another country, to ship of another country, people or agents of another country. Then perhaps there is no treaty that's regulating that relation, but at least we know that a harm is given, an injury, a loss has happened, an injury is given. This is known as Tortious Act. So the objective element tells us that a damage is given because the state did not follow its obligations or the state is involved in a tortious act. This is the first part. Could you follow this part? Any questions?
I couldn't understand the relation between objective elements and
Tort is also part of objective element, because you can see that a damage is given because of an action. The state had to limit its actions, it has gone beyond, and it has given some damage. So this part is objective, because regardless of who you're asking, they can simply tell you that that was the obligation, this is the harm given. Or we see that this is the possession of state B and state A has given harm to that. This is the objective part. The subjective element is the attribution part. If the act is imputable on the state or not. That's so typical in diplomacy. Normally, one state gives harm to another, and the state B, so the injured state, asks for reparations, asks for compensation. And the state A is like, well, wait, it is not my fault. Some people have done it. It is their own fault. It has to be asked them. So they try to run away from their liability, because imputability is a little bit subjective. All right? So it has two elements, objective and subjective. Objective part can be easily sorted out. In the subjective element, if that crime, if that action, or if that passiveness can be attributed on the state or not, that's the question part. Well, what you know is that for attribution, there are certain elements that you have to find out. For instance, well, the state is something abstract, right? Whose state? Whose actions? State's actions. Still, whose state? Well, state is an abstract entity. But the state has, for instance, organs. There are many institutions. If you remember, while we were talking about the Treaty of Laws, we have said that once a state enters into a treaty, then we expect that the state changes its behavior. And our example was environmental treaties. The state is polluting the air. The state enters into an environmental treaty, signs, ratifies. After that process, the state behavior should change. The state should ask all factories install filters, and the state should start inspecting if all those factories have started to implement filters all around the country. And then for those factories that do not install filters, state should then start penalties, sanctions, all right? At that point, what we expect is that, first of all, the signature and ratification takes place, and then here in the parliament, relevant domestic laws are passed so that it becomes a must to install filters on the chimneys. If the parliament does not pass the relevant law, then this is what is meant by the passive damage, and the action of the parliament is attributable to the state. The state has entered into an obligation not to pollute the air anymore, but does not pass the relevant laws. So here liability happens, and it's imputable on the state. So organs, institutions of the state represent the state. Their actions, their breaches are imputable. This is the first thing. Secondly, civil servants. Civil servants are also elements of the state. They are state somehow. They are portions of the state. Therefore, they fulfill the duties given by the state, And while fulfilling those duties, if they somehow start giving damages, then the damages caused by them is still imputable on the state. So, all agents of the state actually, like the army, people working in military, in army. Actually, diplomatic missions are also organs of the state. The thing is that I won't mention them in this class because all the causes related to giving harm to another state, to possessions of another state in your own country, citizens of another country, that's regulated by the diplomatic law. The Russian embassy in Ankara, whose territory is that? The Russian territory. So if Turkish agents give harm to Russian embassy, this is then a harm given to another country. Then we can start talking about state responsibility. But we won't do it. It is better to study it under diplomatic law because there we have to mention some other legal sources. Vienna Conventions. We'll come to that. Therefore, we omit that part, all right? This is one thing. Yes, definitely. That's diplomatic law case rather than state responsibility. Therefore, we have to go visit diplomatic law for that. Agents, civil servants, who else? Actually, well, by the way, we have to mention one more thing. Agents are private individuals, right? They can also be in groups. So, activities of individuals, activities of groups. But our activities, your activities and my activities, we do not represent the state. I do not work for the state. And you're a student, you're a citizen of your own country, but you're not civil servant. You do not represent your country. Therefore, your faults belong to you. You have to repair them on your own. So, individuals as civil servants, individuals as agents of the state, or groups as agents of the state, their activities are also still imputable on the state. Did you understand everything until here? We have to add, you have a question? Yes, please.
Tortious Act?
The possessions of another country, it's like, for instance, you are a soldier, you're making your own, military service. And you have a gun with you, and you have some bombs with you, and you shoot the ship of Greece. So, you act beyond your obligations. We don't come across with actually obligations, and we cannot find a treaty related to you and the Greek ship, right? But what you have done is a Tortious Act. You have given harm to possession of another country, and you are an agent of your state. This is Tortious Act. All right? At the end of the class, we can visit that once again. Remind me of that. Here, what we can add is that things like rebel actions, mob violence. Actually, such actions are carried out by the citizens of one country, and they're not necessarily agents of that state. I mean, they're not civil servants, for instance. They do not represent their state. This is really important, and we can talk about such activities since the Iranian Revolution. I'll come to that. The Islamic Revolution, I mean. Well, this element is encouraging the state. International law is encouraging the state to exercise more control over its own territory and over its own people. So, it's all about exercising more control over its own territory and its own people. Yes?
Same for the terrorist organization that operates in a territory of state.
Let's wait a little bit for that. Okay? Well, in that case, why do we have to mention it? We can talk about controlling the country more since the Iranian Revolution. Are you familiar with the Tehran Hostage case?
Yes.
Yes.
The longest hostage crisis.
How many days was that?
444.
Definitely, it has lasted too long. And that was the Tehran embassy, that was the US embassy in Tehran. And that was seized by whom?
Iranian students, university.
They were students. At that point, we don't see that they're civil servants, that they're agents or they're soldiers. They do not represent their state. They're civilians. And they have seized the US embassy. And according to, well, you're not quite knowledgeable about the diplomatic part. The thing is that US party has expected Iran to take care of that action. So, to take the students out of the embassy and save the embassy. That's what's expected according to diplomatic law. What has happened, in fact, is that, does anyone know?
Students were encouraged by the state in exchange for the Shah coming back from Iran.
So at that point, the state has declared that they support the students. Therefore, the state has become a party. The state become involved in that seizure, embassy seizure. Therefore, since then, international law expects that states have full control over its citizens. For instance, in one of your, close to your borders, let's say, there is a village. People in that village are heavily armed. They're heavily weaponized. And they have some problems in between two villages or whatever. They start shooting across. And while doing so, they also, this is the border, this is state A, that's state B. There is a village, X and Y. They're heavily weaponized and they are shooting at each other. They're even in the possession of some bombs. And they somehow start giving harm to places here. Some houses are damaged, or even worse, some hospitals, schools are damaged. At that point, first of all, probably in state A, civilians are not allowed to get heavily weaponized. So the state had to find it out and penalize those people. Secondly, they're giving harm to another state. That had to be prevented by the state itself. So we expect that state A has full control over those villages. Although they are civilians, once they start harming another country, then because of their actions, the state can be held liable. All right? Therefore, under rebel conditions, under mob violences, state is held responsible. Under terrorist activities, as for your question, probably, if that's a terrorist activity, probably state A is also facing that terrorist problem in itself and probably trying to tackle with that. So the state cannot be held responsible anymore because it is trying to clarify the situation on its own already. We can see some efforts of that state. All right? Any questions until here? Yes, please.
Can more than one state be responsible for a certain act?
Yes, that's possible. True. Yes, please.
How are you going to define the effort of the state? For instance, in
Good.
the Iranian case, Iran may call the students to come back, but is equal enough?
No, well, that's a gray area actually. Under such conditions, if what's happening or efforts of the state has to be determined, then we need a fact-finding mission. We need a group of specialists that have to determine if sufficient is done or not. Okay? So there are no specific things mentioned in international law for that, but commissions can determine that. Yes, please.
When the Israeli consul in Turkey was kidnapped by leftist groups in the 70s.
Let's leave it to diplomatic law. Good question. Let's leave it then. Because it can also be somehow used to explain the case of Khashoggi, for instance. Let's leave it.
No, you said states are not accountable if they try to prevent terrorists. But why don't we say the same for the rebel case? I mean, states also try to diminish the actions of rebellions. Why do we?
If efforts are there, then the state is not responsible anymore. Okay? The thing is that, in my example, there are 2 villages that are heavily weaponized, and that should not have happened. They cannot get armed. That's already under the law of state A, and that law cannot be executed here. That cannot be implemented. So state A is failing. That was the case. So under such conditions, state is responsible. All right. There are always exceptions. What you have to keep in mind is that sovereignty is directly related to direct control of the state in itself. It's not only determining which laws are going to be implemented. The state has to be also fit enough to implement all those laws. That's what's expected, and this is encouraging the state to have that full control. But there are exceptions, for sure. So that's all about attribution. Any questions related to attribution? Then let's move to the damage. Oh, by the way, let's talk about fault a little bit. Here we come across with a faulty action. Well, what we know is that it can be an act, that can be an omission. So that can be active, that can be passive. The thing is that whatever that action is, that somehow contradicts with international law. It violates international law. Then it's a fault. This is the first element. Secondly, the fault can be exercised under good faith or bad faith. That fault has taken place consciously or unconsciously. That can also be an accident. The harm can be given intentionally or unintentionally. So, regardless of all those elements, in the first place, what we focus on is that, is there a fault? We don't ask the question, was that on purpose? Was that conscious, unconscious? If it was done under good faith, then it's not state responsibility. We never say such things. We only concentrate the fault without concentrating on the nature of the fault. The nature of the fault can still determine a lot at the end related to the reparation. The fourth element is about reparation. We'll come to that. But this part, the first 3 elements, is about invocation of the state responsibility. So when state responsibility is established, as long as fault is there, responsibility is established. But at the end, the injured state can show consent, saying that it was done in good faith, I'm not asking for any kind of reparation. Then that's something else. But as specialists, what you have to know is, we do not take a closer look at the nature of the fault. We only concentrate on the fault itself. If there is an action or omission that violates international law, that is in contradiction with the obligations of the injuring state, or if it's a tortious act. We only concentrate on itself, if there is a fault or not. And we don't ask any further questions to determine if state responsibility can be established. I forgot to mention here Ultra-Vires Act. That's how that there are civil agents, civil servants, agents, military personnel, whatever, people representing the state, and their faulty actions causing damage is imputable on the state. And if you remember, we were talking about a case, we were trying to make it up on our own, and we were saying that let's imagine you're conducting your military service on the border as a soldier, and you have your bombs with you, you have weapons with you, and then you're there in order to protect your country against the enemy. That's the thing. And it's nighttime, some animals are approaching, you're bored, you start shooting. And there's a human among them as well. It's already bad enough that you're killing animals. Plus, you give harm to a citizen of another country as well. Now, the first thing is that your obligation was to protect your own country, and what you were doing was beyond your responsibility. This is the first thing. Secondly, you have given harm to possessions and lives in another country. You're a soldier, so your actions are imputable on your state. State responsibility is established until here. So, under Ultra-Vires Act, the actions are still imputable on the state. When the state agent behaves beyond their own duties, still the state is responsible. What you also have to keep in mind is that, first of all, it's attributable. Secondly, as the soldier, you're going to be punished by your own state. So, the individual is going to be punished, but domestically, not internationally. The international part is here. This part is relevant to our class. But you have to keep in mind, the individuals are also punished. Yes?
What if there's a military coup in another state?
That's an extreme position, of course. That's force majeure. Then they have to. Well, actually, in many of the countries, it's like that. All the soldiers are there in order to protect their own countries, of course. So they use munition. After that conflict, well, the courts of that country call those soldiers, saying that we have found out that you have spent this much of munition during the conflict. Justify it. So duties of the soldiers are clarified. They have to defend. But the state is also trying to exercise full control. The state is trying to make sure that the soldiers were behaving according to their own duties. All right? If the soldier cannot justify its munition usage, then the soldier is going to be punished. So the state is trying to ensure two things. It's trying to ensure that it has full control all around the country on its all agents. Secondly, it's trying to ensure that everybody behaves according to their own duties. They fulfill their duties and they do not go beyond it. Once they go beyond their duties, then the state cannot control its agents. This is an indicator of that, all right? Could you follow that part? Do you have any questions related to Ultra-Vires? Another thing, we have said that it's possible that the harm is given to possessions of another country or to citizens of another country. Well, giving harm to citizens of another country is a matter that can better be clarified by diplomatic law. One more thing, human rights violations, especially grave human rights violations. They are also causing huge damage. And sometimes, actually for most of the time, that damage cannot be improved once again, cannot be sufficiently compensated once again. Well, we hold human rights violations, we omit them from state responsibility. We're going to study human rights violations under, does anyone know which law? International criminal law. And human rights law as well, but especially under criminal law, because we're talking about liability, responsibility. Here, when the soldier is acting beyond their responsibility, it's still giving harm to possessions of our country, and the state is held responsible. But imagine, in a foreign mission, your soldiers start executing people, or they start a genocide, or they conduct war crimes, or crimes against humanity. Then those individuals have to bear the responsibility of their own actions. Imagine you being a soldier under Nazi Germany, and your commanders are telling you to start a genocide. Either you have to pick all Jews and put them in a concentration camp, or you have to kill them. Well, under such conditions, what you're doing, a grave violation of human rights. Under such conditions, you're giving harm to individuals, and probably the harm cannot be improved once again. The situation cannot be improved once again. And under such conditions, the soldier cannot say anymore that was an order by my commanders, by generals, I had to follow them. No. Under such conditions, you have to be knowledgeable that you're about to violate human rights. Then you have to carry the responsibility of your own act. Your acts cannot be imputed on your own state. You become a criminal on your own, your state as well, but first you. Therefore, human rights violations are going to be covered under international criminal law. The results of the activities are not imputed on the state, but the individual has to take care, has to carry the liability of their own criminal actions. Human rights violations are crimes, criminal activities. So the individual becomes a criminal, whoever executes them. Someone raises their hand, please.
With regard to Nazi Germany example, if I'm not wrong, if I don't know, in the Nuremberg trial, there were just like a few hundred persons who were judged by the crime. But as you mentioned, if a Nazi German, if a soldier who lived in Nazi Germany had to,
we better not mention it now. We have to go through the entire Nuremberg principles, and then we can clarify it. And then we're going to study it actually under international criminal law. You can keep your question until then. All right? So human rights violations are grave violations. Human rights violations pave way to huge damages. And those damages are given by individuals, and the individuals become criminals once they deal with such crimes. So the damage now. The damage, damage can be material. The damage can be moral. The damage can be direct. Do I have them among my slides? Let's see. So it can be direct, it can be indirect. It can be given directly to the state, or it can be given to the citizens of another state. So there are many versions actually. The damage can be given directly to possessions of a state. But what about the interests of a state? First of all, as international relations scholars, we do not concentrate on the nature of the damage in the first place. What we look for is if a damage is given. The nature of the damage is just like the nature of the fault, important while deciding upon the reparations, on compensations. However, what we know is that international courts tend to call for reparations under direct damages. Under indirect damages, commissions are necessary. Well, because indirect, to what extent that state is injured, to what extent indirectly their interests are damaged, they have to be determined by a fact-finding commission. A commission is going to be established. Well, the members can be politicians, members can be diplomats, members can be specialists, they can be scholars. The most important thing is that the commission is established and it's composed of people that are compatible to tell about the nature of the damage, to what extent the state is injured, what kind of a loss has taken place. Once a person is killed, well, the material damage is given already on the physical being of the killed person. And the moral damage is given to their relatives. Do you remember the case of Rainbow Warrior? I cannot draw, by the way. Well, the Rainbow Warrior, Greenpeace. Do you remember the case? Yes.
One, I think, photographer or journalist was killed because
True.
of French.
True. This Greenpeace ship was in territorial waters of New Zealand. And in the Pacific Ocean, France was getting ready to conduct a nuclear test. And Greenpeace just wanted to demonstrate their protest the action. France have heard about that and sent 2 scuba divers. Scuba divers have placed 2 explosives and left the ship. And the ship was badly damaged after the explosion, plus some people died there. And well, who died there? Actually, as Batu has mentioned, they're photographers, journalists, so they were not dangerous people. At the end, New Zealand has asked for reparations from France. They couldn't sort it out in between, and therefore they had to ask for an arbitrator. The UN Secretary General was called to mediate for this case, and Secretary General has seen what has happened exactly and found out that, first of all, yes, the ship is damaged and compensations have to be paid for the ship itself. Plus, one person has died and the person has a widowed and some kids left behind. So New Zealand state has also represented the widowed ones and the kids as well, and asked for moral reparations because the moral damage was given to those children and the widowed ones. So in that case, we come across with the material damage plus moral damage given. That was also the case for the Gaza flotilla case. Some people died there, of course. I don't remember how many actually, but 9 people. So there we can also talk about a moral damage given. This part is, actually I want you to learn about those terminology just in case you take some examinations for Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Economics, whatever. We can talk about initial damage or immediate damage, or we can talk about immediate damage. Immediate damage is the direct damage given. And immediate damage is giving harm to the citizens of another state. which is subject under diplomatic law. Just be familiar with the terminology. That's why it's among our slides. Until now, we have studied how state responsibility is established. And at the moment, you know that, first of all, you have to find out that there was an obligation or the state has given a damage to possessions and lives of another state. So a tort is there or obligation is there, and a fault has taken place. A legally wrongful act has taken place, and that action is imputable on the state. As a result of that action, there must also be a damage. Well, there are some cases that no damage is given. They're just simple violations. Turkish state has decided to establish nuclear plants in Akkuyu. And Turkish state has declared it before its public, saying that we're going to establish nuclear plants. Turkey is a party to International Atomic Energy Agency. According to the protocols concluded in between Turkish state and the agency, Turkish state is expected to notify agency as soon as it decides to establish nuclear plants and send them the design plans. What kind of a building is going to be built and which materials are going to be used and what kind of a geography is that? Is it proper for a nuclear plant? Agents, after Turkish state declared about Akkuyu to its entire public, agencies said, well, no one has notified us. So there we can speak about a violation of Turkish state. The thing is that that violation did not cause any damages. And that was actually not intentional. After agency warned Turkish state said, okay, sorry, oops, that was a mistake. We're sending you the designs over. We're sending you our plans. And they did so immediately. So not all violations are cases of state responsibility. As a result of the violation or breach, a damage must take place. Then state responsibility is established. So the first three elements are about the obligation, the breach, attribution, and damage. After that, we come to reparation. Before we talk about reparation part, let's mention the circumstances precluding wrongfulness. What does that mean? Sometimes all those three elements take place. A breach is there that causes damage. It's attributable to the state, but state A still should not repair the damage because it's completely legitimate what it has done. So under what conditions does that take place? Under state consent. We remember a case under which Russian planes have dropped explosives on a group of Turkish soldiers in the northern part of Syria. And Turkish soldiers died there. So state B has given harm to state A. Its citizens are killed. Perhaps some possessions are also damaged. At the end of that process, do you remember what has happened? What Turkish state has said? Turkish state has said, we have given the wrong coordinations to Russian planes. So, Turkish state shows consent for the damage. Turkish state is not looking for reparations. Turkish state is not asking for any kind of compensation. State consent is there, therefore we don't ask for compensation. So this is the first thing. Self-defense or countermeasure. Well, when does self-defense take place? When the state is attacked by another state. Let's say one state, either a coup d'etat is taking place or the state is attacked either by another state or by terrorists. Under such conditions, the state is not able to fulfill some of its obligations. And because it cannot fulfill, it's giving damages. Still, because it was under self-defense conditions, the state's actions are found completely legitimate and no compensation is required. This is also the case for countermeasures. Countermeasures, well, let's start off like that. Imagine you're state A and you have made a treaty with state B about sharing the waters of one river, all right? The river flows from you to state B, and you hear that a nuclear explosion has taken place here in state X. Radiation is approaching to your state. Once radiation reaches to your waters, the contamination will continue all through those villages here first and then go to state B, and it has many branches there as well. Numerous people are going to be affected. Then, although through one treaty you have promised to share the waters of your river, you take countermeasures. You close the entire river. The dam is collecting water. You're not sending any water because you're trying to prevent something happening. This is known as countermeasure. At that place, you're not fulfilling your obligation to share the waters, but that's completely legitimate. Perhaps some villages suffer a lot because they cannot get any water from you. Still, you don't have to pay compensation. That's completely legitimate because it was countermeasures. And lastly, force majeure. What's that? In Turkish? Mücbir sebepler. Force majeure is unpreventable conditions, like an earthquake, a war. That's true, that's also force majeure, of course. You cannot prevent it. So either some catastrophes are taking place, like an earthquake, like tsunami, or you're being attacked by another country. So under such conditions, you cannot fulfill your obligations, although you give harm. No one asks for reparations. One more element perhaps you better be familiar with. That's known as l'état de nécessité. Under l'état de nécessité, necessary conditions, but like force majeure, I mean, French terminology are picked for those conditions. Therefore, it's better that you're familiar with them as well. So under l'état de nécessité, what you have to keep in mind is that your state has their own interests. And state B is sharing some interests with you, but they have less interests. Then you have to make a sacrifice, and what you sacrifice is state B's interests, because there are less interests, you know. So you pick among them, and you give harm to another state, but it was necessary under such conditions, and you have sacrificed the less interests. Then this is also possible that it precludes wrongfulness, but depends. Just keep in mind, I mean, if you hear that a harm is given under l'état de nécessité, then you know what has happened. That's the most important part for me at this point, all right? Let's come to the consequences, the last part, the reparation part. On the reparation, well, there are certain things, certain steps. If the harm I'm giving to your state is a continuum, like I'm poisoning the water, people are dying in your country, I'm still poisoning the water, but I'm trying to compensate for those relatives. No, first, cessation is necessary. First, I have to stop poisoning the water. So, first of all, the wrongful act, if it's not a sudden act, but if it's a continuum, that has to be ceased, that has to be stopped as soon as possible. So the first necessary consequence is asking for cessation. The second thing is non-repetition. If you remember, we have mentioned the nature of the fault, if it was intentional or unintentional, if it was dolus or culpa. So, if it was intentional, perhaps I can do it once again. So, negotiations, diplomacy is quite necessary at that stage to find out why did that violation take place. If it was intentional, do I intend to make it once again? And non-repetition has to be sustained. It has to be reached. After cessation takes place, then we look for compensations, of course. Repairing the damage is necessary. And under reparation, the first necessary thing is asking for restitution, if possible. That's not always possible. Restitution is only possible for material damages. And what does it mean, by the way, restitution? The ship was complete, you give harm to it. Once you repair it, it takes its initial shape once again. That's restitution. Making it fine once again, giving its initial shape to it back again. But it's impossible if you're killing a person, for instance. Or if you're giving harm to nature, it takes too long. Second thing is compensation. And that requires negotiations as well, because in international law, there are no fixed rates for damages or anything. So we do not know how does that take place. The states have to get in touch with each other. The injured state shares what kind of a damage is given at what material level and what kind of a compensation is necessary. And negotiations take place in between. The third important element is satisfaction. Compensation is not always material, it's not always money. For instance, for the Rainbow Warrior case, New Zealand has received, if I'm not mistaken, $7 million, something like that. Plus, they have asked that 2 or 3 French soldiers have to remain for 3 years in diverse places around Pacific. So satisfaction element is an important element in state responsibility. The injured party has to be satisfied by the reparation forms at the end.
If they abuse it, or like when they are satisfied, the commission is going to decide, right? Or
no, there's not. I mean, commission is not always there. Commission is there when necessary, if both parties show consent for establishment of a commission. The thing is that satisfaction or determining what amount of compensation is going to be paid is a matter of diplomacy. So the parties talk to each other, they negotiate, they discuss, and commissions are just established when both of the parties show consent. Then, it's not always, that's not something fixed. My goodness, I have the Turkish words here. I didn't know that. Yes.
If there's no diplomacy between two different countries, and if there's a damage, like
they get in touch, they talk, they arrange talks. I mean, existence of diplomacy is not necessarily having embassies or having ambassadors in those embassies. Perhaps there are problems in that, but still under such conditions, if the injured state is looking for reparations, then they need to talk to each other. They have to tell, you have given me this amount of damage. And in order to make it fine once again, you have to pay that much, for instance. So if they do not get in touch, then they cannot communicate. One more point that you have to keep in mind. I guess it's not here. In international law, reprisals are not allowed. States do not take revenge as a result of this process. Okay? And please don't use the word revenge in your exams. Keep in mind, reprisal is not allowed. So the state has to look for reparations through legal ways, not by giving the same harm to its counterpart. All right? Could you follow everything until here? Any questions? Yes?
So you talk about damages being done to another state's property or people. So can that be also, must that also always be in the foreign territory, or like can a state do harm to another state's citizens in its own country?
That's also possible in your own country. Imagine, as Turkey, you have your own territorial waters, and U.S. flagship is in your territorial waters, and you give harm to U.S. ship in your own territory. That's also possible. That's okay. That's possible. Any other questions? No? If not, that's all about state responsibility, actually. I'm going to upload my entire slides as soon as possible on the Moodle so that you can go through them. And you have your readings as well if you need to see more cases in the book. Multiple cases are already mentioned. Did you sign the attendance? And where is the attendance? Thank you. Then enjoy the rest of your day.